Welcome back to the Brittany Hughes Show, everybody. Happy post-election time. We finally made it. Gosh, it feels like you run a marathon and you finally get to the end of it, I swear. So the good news is that there's no more campaign ads on the TV. Of course, I guess unless you live in a place where there's going to be a runoff or something. For the most part, the vast majority of us can finally watch TV without being constantly inundated by people preaching at us about who we should vote for, which would be fantastic. You know, I understand political. I understand that, you know, a lot of times elections come down to where money is being spent. I get that. At the same time, I've always kind of wondered when you're watching TV, is anybody actually being swayed by these election ads? I mean, they're the most hyperbolic things. They're absolutely ridiculous, half of them. Is anybody actually sitting there going, you know, it's 2 days before election day and gosh, I really just, you know, I don't know who I'm going to vote for, but that 30-second ad right there, that just makes the decision so much easier. I don't know anybody that's actually swayed by that. So thankfully, we've gotten rid of those, at least until the 2024 election gets up and running, which should be like, I don't know, like next week. It's kind of the equivalent of Christmas stuff being put out in stores on like July 5th. You don't get any breathing room between holidays whatsoever. We just sort of roll right on into the next one. So for the next 48 hours, you may get somewhat of a reprieve from campaign ads. But of course, the red wave that was predicted did not seem to happen. It looks now 2 days after election night like Republicans may end up holding control of the House. Things might be a little bit more optimistic than was originally thought. But of course, a lot of experts and a lot of pundits on the right had predicted this massive sweeping red tsunami where Republicans were going to pick up umpteen gazillion House seats, and it wasn't going to be even a close contest, and it was going to be a full and total national repudiation of the Biden administration and this radical left-wing agenda that's been pushed on us for the last couple of years. And obviously that didn't happen. At best, it was maybe a pink trickle. There were some races that were considered much closer than they ended up actually being. So I think that, of course, the Monday morning quarterbacking has now begun, and Republicans are trying to figure out what in the world went wrong. Because if you can't pull off a red wave in the middle of record high inflation, in the middle of rampant bad foreign policy decisions, in the middle of a war on energy, in the middle of all of this woke nonsense going on in schools, if you can't pull off a red wave in the middle of all of this insanity, when are you going to be able to pull it off? And I think that's the question that a lot of conservatives are grappling with. And a lot of the analysis has been in the form of finger pointing, right? It's kind of like after the Super Bowl, the losing team wants somebody to hang for it, figuring out who in the world to blame for something that seems to have gone catastrophically wrong. So now there's a lot of question over were the right candidates put up? Was money spent in the right place? Is this Mitch McConnell's fault? Is this Donald Trump's fault? What role does he play moving forward? And so there are a lot of questions that I think deserve to be asked and hopefully answered for the Republican Party moving forward and for conservatives who I think we're planning on seeing the left, which to many of us on the right, it seems extremely obvious where leftist policies get you, right? They get you heading into Thanksgiving week paying 35% more for a carton of eggs because of bad economic policies. And I think a lot of people thought that that was going to be so incredibly obvious to the vast majority of Americans. And it seems like maybe a ball got dropped somewhere in this messaging. So figuring out what went wrong, I think, is a multi-pronged question that's got a more complicated answer. First of all, I'm going to throw this at you just kind of as a bit of a funny story that you may not have heard with all of this hoopla over Tuesday. Did you know that a dead Democrat actually won in Pennsylvania? Did you see that?
Of course, officials are continuing to count ballots after yesterday's election, but there's one race in Pennsylvania that's really turning heads. Democratic Representative Tony DeLuca, he represented the Pittsburgh suburbs for 39 years. He won by a landslide, even though he died last month of cancer.
So RIP there. But he ended up winning re-election anyway. So the only other person on the ballot apparently was a Green Party candidate. There was no Republican on the ballot. And DeLuca ended up winning by like a landslide victory, even though, again, he's been pushing up daisies for the last 4 weeks. So the seat is going to remain empty until a special election can be held.
His name was still on the ballot and he had no challenger. A Green Party candidate did get some votes, but DeLuca won with 85% of the ballots counted. A special election will take place to fill that vacancy.
Wild. Absolutely, only in Pennsylvania, only in a state like that, where again, some of these states they can't even count ballots quickly. You would think that if a state like Florida could get all of their ballots in and count them and have a result on the night of the election, places like Pennsylvania and Arizona would be able to do the same. But apparently that's just way too much to ask in today's day and age. So all that to say, dead Democrat ended up winning re-election. I thought that dead people voted for Democrats. I didn't realize that people voted for dead Democrats, but apparently that's what happened in Pennsylvania. So a little bit of a ha-ha funny story there, but the rest of the story from Election Day seems to be a lot more serious, and people are seriously upset about it. So I think it's important to understand when looking at the actual results of the election, I think that the numbers themselves tell a much more nuanced story. At the end of the day, especially when it comes to seats in Congress, a win is a win and a loss is a loss. I understand that. You either win a seat or you don't. It doesn't really matter, what margin you came in at when it comes to whether or not you won your seat, right? You don't get any points for closing a gap. At the same time, I do think that looking at the numbers and looking at where Republicans gained some ground and where Democrats lost ground is going to be an important factor moving forward. And it's an important factor to look at when trying to understand exactly what happened and what Americans were trying to say on election night. And when it comes to strategy, when it comes to political strategy, like a giant game of Risk, understanding those nuances is what will help you move forward. So if you actually look at the numbers, there were a lot of races that came down to much more narrow margins than previously held in very blue districts. Of course, we saw landslide victories in places like Florida for Ron DeSantis, where he was overwhelmingly reelected, largely with the help of Latino voters, and even in deep blue areas like Miami-Dade County, which went overwhelmingly in favor of DeSantis. Those coattails held for Senator Marco Rubio, who was elected in a landslide victory to his third term in the Senate. So obviously you had places like that where very deep blue areas did flip. Even in places, though, where they didn't, even in places that still held blue, in places like Virginia, for example, my home state, we had two elections that came down to a much closer margin than they have in the past. Hung Cao running against Jennifer Wexton in Virginia 10. He narrowed that gap. He did not win. That is significant, obviously. A win is a win. But at the same time, closing the gap as much as he was able to do, I think, is very indicative of a shift in the political landscape. Same exact thing happened in the Vega versus Spanberger race, where that gap came down to being much, much closer than it has in the past in these deep blue districts. So I think that it's important to look at where the left lost ground. If you look at the exit polls, if you look at the demographics that went blue, I think that those numbers tell a very important story. For example, CNN's exit polls showed that Republicans actually narrowed the gap with women. So Democrats did pull about 8% more women voters than Republicans did. That's down from their 19-point lead that they had in 2018, though. That is a significant margin closure there. 4 years ago, in 2018, in the midterms in 2018, Democrats pulled women by 19 points. That was down to only 8 points this year. And if you look across just about every single demographic, Democrats lost ground with even some of their most ardent supporters. They lost ground with urban, suburban, and rural voters. For example, Democrats had carried urban voters in 2018 by a margin of 33 points. This year, that margin was narrowed to 17 points. Again, it's not that they didn't win these demographics. It's not that they didn't still carry even by a wide margin of victory, but the gap significantly narrowed with suburban voters. Republicans actually carried that demographic by 6 percentage points, whereas 4 years ago, it was a dead heat. Rural voters, Republicans widened their margin with rural voters from 14 points in 2018 to 29 points in 2022. Here's another thing that's very interesting. By age, Democrats lost ground even with younger voters. Democrats carried younger voters between the ages of 18 and 29 years old in 2018 by a margin of 35 points. This year, that margin shrunk to 28 points. Between the ages of 30 and 44 years old, Democrats carried that demographic in 2018 by 19 points. In 2022, this past midterm on election night, that margin was only 4 points. Democrats are losing ground with their own demographics that they have carried for years across race and ethnicity. And I think this is something that we saw widespread in places like Florida. But even in deep blue districts, white men voted overwhelmingly for Republicans by a margin of 28 points. White women voted for Republicans by 8 points. But among Black women, who voted in favor of Democrats in 2018 by 85 percentage points, that dropped to 78 percentage points this year. Black men who overwhelmingly voted for Democrats in 2018 by 76 percentage points, that margin was down to 65. So again, still wide margins, but what I think that you're seeing is a chipping away in some of these very blue demographics that have historically voted overwhelmingly in favor of Democrats. Democrats are losing ground. And I think that that's a very interesting story, because when you look at political messaging and who you have to reach, you have to look at the breakdown here. This is why this is important. Republicans lost one particular demographic by an incredibly wide margin. And that's going to be very important moving forward. And it kind of goes to the heart of what I want to talk about today, because as we look about who's to blame here, when we look at why Republicans maybe did not carry the red wave as big as some people had predicted, this, I think, tells a much bigger story. Republicans lost unmarried people, particularly unmarried women, by a huge factor. This was the single demographic when it comes to relationship status, which I think underpins a lot of other demographic factors. This is the one demographic where Republicans really struggled. According to the National Election Pool, which tallies all of the exit polls and sort of lumps them together and averages them out, voters who identified as married voted 58% in favor of Republicans and 41% for Democrats. But unmarried voters went 59% for Democrats to 39% for Republicans. When you break that down by gender, the story gets even more interesting. Married men broke Republican by about 20 points. Married women broke Republican by about 14 points. Unmarried men went Republican by about 7 points. But unmarried women voted in favor of Democrats by 37 points. That is a major factor. And when we looked at the political messaging, whether it was from the leftist media or campaigns, if you looked at the political messaging heading into the midterms, because the left knew that they weren't going to be able to run on a strong economic platform, right? Not with inflation being sky high. They weren't going to be able to run on a strong energy platform, not with this war on energy and not with the green agenda that they have to appease. They weren't going to be able to run on the record of the last 2 years because Joe Biden's poll numbers were in the toilet and things haven't been looking great. What they did run on, however, was a strong message of Republicans want to take away abortion rights. And that was, I think, a key factor for particularly unmarried younger women voters. And there was a lot of fear mongering going on that I think contributed to this divide. Now, it's important to point out that when it comes to married voters versus unmarried voters, this is not a new disparity, right? For example, in 2016, Donald Trump pulled 52% of the married vote, but among unmarried voters, he only won 37%. Okay, so these numbers have kind of held true for a while. Generally speaking, when it was broken down by individual counties, Trump did much better in areas that had more two-parent families than he did in counties with single-parent families, okay? So this is not something that's new. Married people tend to vote more Republican. Unmarried younger people tend to vote more Democrat. This is not some big secret. I'm not telling you something that you've never heard before. But I do think that that's going to be very important moving forward, and it's important to understand why. So when we look at unmarried women in particular, that sub-demographic of unmarried Americans who are voting, unmarried women, what do we know about this particular demographic? Well, First of all, they tend to be unhappier. There is actually a study, if you do some basic Googling, there was a study that came out not too terribly long ago that purported that unmarried childless women are actually among the happiest people in the entire country. They are living footloose and fancy free. Everything is great for them. They don't have children. They don't have somebody that they're tied to. They're out there living in New York City, going to all the clubs, and life is just absolutely wonderful for them. And that was an interesting study, and it was picked up by the leftist media and run with as gospel truth, because it countered the long-running historical narrative that a lot of other studies had showed, saying that unmarried people, in particular women, tend to be among the unhappiest people. It turns out, if you actually dig into that study, because nobody wants to read the actual study, everybody just wants to read the analysis of the study. If you look at the actual study, the guy that did the analysis of it, and that's what was picked up by all of the leftist media and all of these pundits saying, hey, look, being unmarried and childless is actually fantastic, because of course that flies in the face of pretty much everything that conservatives believe. If you look at the analysis itself, it turns out the guy that wrote that completely misread the information. He did not understand the assignment. He misread the data and misconstrued what it said. If you look at other studies that have looked at the same exact question, according to one, married women without children actually reported being very happy at a rate of 45%. Married women with children reported being very happy at a rate of 41%. Women who have never been married, however, those without children, reported rates of being very happy at only 24%, with children at 19%. So what you see here, and this has been echoed across multiple studies, this most recent one that was completely bungled notwithstanding, multiple studies have borne out that unmarried women tend to report much higher rates of unhappiness than married women do. That is not unheard of. That's something that has been looked at for many years and something that has been borne out by pretty much all of the data. Women are much more likely to be searching for identity. One study found that Gen Z women are roughly 3 times more likely to identify as LGBTQ than their male counterparts. I think that there is a pretty simple story there, and I might be about to say something that's going to tick a lot of people off, but I think that when it comes to women searching for identity, in a culture that is consistently pressing the message that you do not need to get married, there's nothing to be found in marriage, you don't need to be a wife, there's nothing fulfilling to be found about motherhood, you're going to lose your identity in yourself if you do that, you need to live for yourself. If you don't find some sort of core grounding and structure and identity in marriage and in motherhood, as a woman's role in not only your own life, but in society at large. And that's not abdicating men of their role. Okay, men have a different role to play. And that is an entirely related but separate discussion. We're talking specifically about women here. And I think that when you take away any factor of identity in motherhood and in being a wife and in having a role in a family structure, women then go in search of identity elsewhere. You're going to try to find it in some group or in some characteristic or in some cause. You're going to try to find where you fit. If not in a family structure, you're going to try to find it somewhere else. And I think that this is part of what plays into the search for identity. We see it a lot among youth, and we see it among unmarried women. Another factor that's not going to surprise anybody, but is an important thing to talk about when looking at the political landscape, is that unmarried women are far more likely to care about abortion rights. And not shockingly, it's because they are the demographic that is more likely to say that they need abortion access, right? So unmarried women are overwhelmingly the demographic that seeks abortions. If you listen to the leftist narrative when it comes to defensive abortions, all of the sob stories that they like to throw out, when it comes to medical anomalies, when it comes to fetal diagnoses, when it comes to the life of the mother, when it comes to a woman that might be in an abusive marriage or was raped by a spouse, all of these sob stories that the left likes to push as reasons why we need whole-scale abortion access all the way up through the 9th month with no restrictions whatsoever. These are singularly infrequent stories that they like to posture as much more widespread than they actually are. The simple, very basic truth that anybody with common sense understands about abortion is that the vast majority of them are sought by unmarried women who never intended to become pregnant and are in relationships, or maybe not even in a committed relationship, with someone with whom they never planned to have a child. The vast majority of abortion seekers are unmarried women who didn't want to get pregnant in the first place. They are not married women who got pregnant on purpose only to find out that their baby may be born with some horrific anomaly that's going to probably kill them before or immediately after birth. That is not who is most commonly seeking abortions. According to the New York Times, 86% of women who have abortions are unmarried. So I think one of the things that the pro-life movement, when looking at this demographic, and Republicans when looking at the demographic of unmarried women and why they are losing them in such high rates, I think one of the keys is to look at the nuance behind the abortion issue and our messaging, particularly to unmarried women, okay? We have long held in the pro-life movement that the key behind making abortion unthinkable is educating people on the science behind what abortion is and stages of development of an unborn baby. If we can just educate women on when a heartbeat begins, oftentimes before they even realize that they're pregnant in the first place. If we can just educate women on what abortion actually does, if we can just educate women on the development of a child in the womb, it will be so horrifying that no one will be able to imagine ever aborting a child. If we can just convince them of the scientific facts behind this procedure, that will be the nail in the coffin for abortion. I no longer think that that's the case. And I think the reason that we have trouble grappling with that truth is because it is heartbreaking to imagine that anybody could understand fetal development and abortion in truth and still choose to go through with it. It's very difficult to imagine, but I think that's what happens every single day. I'm not saying that every single person, I'm not saying that abortion education is not important. I'm not saying that Planned Parenthood doesn't lie to young women and convince them that this is a clump of cells. All of that is 100% true. But we also live in the information age where everything is accessible on smartphones, right? It's no longer as easy to keep women in the dark. I don't think that the answer here or that the problem here is just that people don't understand what abortion is. I think part of the problem here is that we have created a social environment that fosters singleness as opposed to committed relationships. And in order to make abortion unthinkable, we have to create an environment in which abortion is also seen as unnecessary. Otherwise, you are always going to have unmarried women who did not plan to find themselves in this position, who, even if they understand what abortion is, even if they understand the developmental aspects of an unborn child, they are going to choose fear and desperation and, in some cases, selfishness simply because it is readily accessible to them. And I think that this is a demographic that votes overwhelmingly in support of abortion rights. And it goes hand in hand with the fact that we have told young people on both the right and the left that marriage is not something to be aspired to. Marriage is something to be kicked down the road. Motherhood and parenthood in general is something to be put off as long as possible. Focus on your career, focus on yourself, do what makes you happy, live for yourself for a while, enjoy your 20s and your early 30s. And if eventually you get around to marriage and child rearing, then that's absolutely fine, but don't push it. Make sure that you take plenty of time. And marriage has become something that we encourage young people to put on the back burner. And I think when it comes to looking at how this affects the political landscape, that's a very important factor. Ron DeSantis, if you look at his overwhelming victory in Florida, and Glenn Youngkin, who won in Virginia before him, if you look at these two races and the landslide victories, okay, for Ron DeSantis, and the fact that Glenn Youngkin was able to defeat Terry McAuliffe, who had already been a governor, he was able to win as a Republican in what has become a very, very purple state. I think one thing that both of these guys proved is that strong families, not just voters, strong families carry extreme political power. And marriage and parenthood is what undergirds a lot of their beliefs and the issues they tend to vote on. Parents are the ones who care about public education and the people that run it and are more likely to vote on strong conservative values that say, look, I'm not saying that you can't teach your kids one thing or the other. I'm just saying that parents are the ones who are in charge of their child's education, not state bureaucrats. Kids belong to families, not to the government. Parents are the ones who are going to care about that issue, and aspiring parents who are looking forward to having children. Families and parents are the ones who are going to be paying attention and care about the woke ideology that's being shoved down children's throats at a very young age, whether it's through schools or through Hollywood and what comes in through our TV sets. Parents are the ones who care about COVID closures and keeping children out of classrooms and the academic disaster that created. Parents are the ones who cared about making sure that children were not put under insane vaccine mandates. Families and parents are the ones who care most about being able to pay their bills and about the economic foundation and about whether or not grocery store prices are going up, because families are the ones that are having to care about feeding mouths that are not just their own. Families and parents are the ones who care about most of the issues that make up the core of the conservative message. It's families and parents. Now, please understand, I am not saying that there are not single conservatives out there or that there are single moderates out there who care about these issues. I'm not saying that just because you're single, you haven't gotten married yet, or you don't have children, that you can't care about economics or you can't care about education. I know that a lot of people do. But what I'm saying is that the numbers bear out that when it comes to who tends to vote on these issues, it's families and parents. And marriage as a social structure is what makes up the basis for that. Being married is what makes you most likely to rank abortion as not your top voting issue. Even among pro-choice Americans, you tend to vote on the issue that impacts your life the most. And if abortion is not it, even if you believe that abortion should be a legal and accessible right, that's likely not going to be your top issue heading into the polls. Being married makes you, by and large, improving your financial situation. Married people tend to have much more stable financial positions. That is a basic fact. You can go look that up. That has been borne out across many studies over many years. This makes you much less dependent on the government. Being married people are much more likely not to live with their parents or be on welfare, which means that you place a much higher priority on the economy. Being married with children makes you much more likely to value things like school choice and the public education system. Being married, especially with children, raises your level of personal responsibility because now you have to concentrate on somebody other than just yourself. Marriage serves as the foundation for the values and the goals that underlie the vast majority of conservative positions. Now, why am I harping on this so much? Because you might say, well, of course, conservatives have always valued marriage and we've always touted family values. Here's why I think this matters. Because I think across the political spectrum, as a social structure, as a society, we have begun to push or at best accept that younger people are getting married much, much later in life. I think that we have done an extremely poor job over the past 30 or 40 years of modeling healthy, strong, committed marriages in front of kids. The divorce rate has skyrocketed. Many children that are now entering adolescence or looking at marriage as a potential factor in the next 10 years of their life grew up in homes that were broken or unstable and did not see healthy marriages modeled in front of them. Which makes sense. If you grew up in a home where marriage was not something that was ever viewed in a positive light, why in the world would you want that for yourself? And I think we are starting to see the natural effect of broken families and higher divorce rates on whether or not future generations even see marriage as something to be valued or aspired to at all. I think the same thing is true of parenthood, when children are viewed as burdens, when we harp about how expensive they are, kick that can down the road as far as you can. Why would anybody then look at that and say, oh, wow, let's get married and have children in our early 20s? That sounds fantastic. We have built these things up as net negatives on your life. And now the message is to encourage 20-somethings to go out and live for themselves, go live in the city, go travel, go build up your career, concentrate on that. And if you get around to marriage in the future, great, but you don't have to. And that's largely been what's been pushed. So then it's no surprise that according to Pew Research, the share of adults ages 25 to 54 who are currently married fell from 67% in 1990 to 53% in 2009. The percentage of Americans who have never been married in that same time frame has grown from 17% to 33%. This is the problem. This is the problem. When you look at the demographics that Republicans lost in the midterms, when you look at the issues that mattered most to people that voted blue in the midterms, and you look at how marriage and how marriage as a contributing factor to the way that young people view the world, that has a direct impact on what issues matter to them, on how they see things, and therefore how they vote. And we are living in a culture where marriage is rapidly declining, where our childbirth rate is rapidly declining, where the foundation on which conservative values, and not just what people believe, but why they vote the way that they vote, we're starting to see an erosion of that foundation. And it's important for conservatives moving forward to understand this. And we didn't get here overnight. This isn't something that happened at the drop of a hat. And this isn't something that's going to be flipped like a switch heading into 2024. Now, I think that there are a lot of questions moving forward for conservatives when it comes to reaching out to voters on the issues that matter the most. I think that quality of candidates matters, and we need to take a hard look at who we are putting in front of voters and asking them to support. I think that it's an important question to ask whether or not money is being spent in the right place. I think it's an important question to ask what role Donald Trump played in all this and what role he may or may not play in the Republican Party moving forward. I think that all of those are understandable and important questions. I don't think there's some silver bullet here where there's one issue, and if we just get that right, that it'll change everything in favor of conservative values. I think that if it were that simple, somebody would have figured it out. My analysis would probably be a moot point. But I do think that when looking at the changing demographics of this country, looking at marriage as an institution, and taking a hard look at ourselves and how we got here and how we may have contributed, I think is going to be very important moving forward. If you want to grow a generation of right-leaning voters, not because they vote for a candidate that they simply like. It's not about making sure that you put just the most suave person up there with the most captivating message. It has to be about building a foundation of conservative values. And much of that is directly correlated to marriage and the family structure. And I think that's going to be very important moving forward. And I think it's something that we're not talking about nearly enough because, again, we would have to take accountability for how we got here. And also because I think we want a quick fix. I think that people want a quick fix in terms of figuring out how in the world, again, if you cannot have a wave in support of conservative, right-leaning policies in a climate such as ours, when can you have it? And I think that people want a fast answer. Who do we blame for this, and how do we fix it immediately? And I'm not sure that it's that simple. I think that we've got a changing social fabric. And if we're going to address that, we need to wise up to it real fast. That's just my 2 cents. Thank you for tuning into the Brittany Hughes Show. We're going to try to move forward from elections after this, by the way, because I think everybody's kind of sick of it. Make sure while I've got you, though, that you head on over to Apple Podcasts, hit the subscribe button on the Brittany Hughes Show. That way you won't miss an episode. We have been growing our following. So for those of you who have subscribed and listen weekly, thank you so much for your support. We have been seeing fantastic progress on the podcast charts. So thank you very much for that. Also, make sure that you subscribe to the Newsbusters podcast. Tim Graham over there there does a phenomenal job of breaking down media bias on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. That is an absolute cannot miss podcast. So make sure that you check that out as well. I will see you guys back here on Thursday. Have a blessed weekend.